Hello dear students, welcome back. Today we are meeting to resume our chapter that we started yesterday in the first part of the video of the chapter The Address, written by Marga Minku. So today we shall resume it and let's start today's discussion. So dear students, we left our discussion yesterday till here, where we found that the mother and the narrator with her mother was having a conversation, and her mother told her that Mrs. Darling visited their place regularly, and every time she went back, she took something home with her. And these things included table, silver, antique plates, large vases, and crockery. And she used to tell the narrator's mother that she wanted to save all her nice things in case they had to leave. But this day, when the narrator had paid a visit to Mrs. Darling in order to take back all the things that once was taken from her mother, so she has come to claim all those things. But the lady, Mrs. Darling, has no mind to return the things she had taken away, and we find that she is thoroughly opportunist lady. So finally, here in this paragraph, the narrator asked her mother if she really wanted her to take all the things with her. And to this, her mother replied that even if she didn't, it would be an insult to ask her not to. And she was going out with the risk herself, a suitcase full of items. Now we are going to resume our discussion from the next paragraph. My mother seemed to notice that I was not entirely convinced. She looked at me reprovingly, and after that we spoke no more about it. Meanwhile, I had arrived at the station without having paid much attention to things on the way. I was walking in familiar places again for the first time since the war, but I didn't want to go further than was necessary. I didn't want to upset myself with the sight of streets and houses full of memories from a precious time. So her mother noticed that she wasn't convinced and looked at her critically. And after that day, critically, reprovingly here means critically. So the narrator was not convinced with the answer what her mother had given her when she had asked that why did you allow her to take all our precious items and articles. So she said that it would be an insult to her if I'll ask this thing, because she herself had taken care of all our articles. So it would be an insult. So this answer did not convince the narrator, and she found, looking at her mother, she found that my mother is also understanding that her answer is not convincing at all. And then they decided they will not talk over this issue again. Okay, so after that day, they never talked about the incident again, and she reached the station without noticing any details on the way. So the scene here is that the narrator is going back to the station as the lady, Mrs. Darling, did not open the door, and this visit was, bit disappointed for the narrator. She was disappointed by this first visit to Mrs. Darling, and she did not met her, she did not talk to her. So she was going back to the railway station to go back to her town. So when she reached the station without noticing any deals on the way, and she passed the familiar things after the war for the first time. So this was her first visit after the war had ended, and she was walking through the familiar streets and familiar areas and familiar surroundings, but still the things have changed so far that though she was in her familiar areas, familiar surroundings, but she felt that she is at new place because everything got changed. And she didn't want to upset herself with the familiar sights of houses and streets that reminded her of all the precious times. So all the lovely days, beautiful days, all her childhood days have gone by now before the war, and she did not want to gloom herself, by devoting herself into the past gloomy days. Okay. Now further she says, in the train back I saw Mrs. Darling in front of me again, as I had the first time I met her. It was the morning after the day my mother had told me about her. I had got up late, and coming downstairs I saw my mother about to see someone out, a woman with a broad back. There is my daughter, said my mother. She beckoned to me. The woman nodded and picked up the suitcase under the coat rack. She wore a brown coat and a shapeless hat. Does she live far away? I asked, seeing the difficulty she had going out of the house with the heavy case. In Marconi Street, said my mother. Number 46. Remember that. So while traveling back to her town, when she was going back in the train, so she had gone back in the time, and she saw Mrs. Darling in person a day after her mother told her daughter about her. And she woke up late that morning, and as she was going downstairs, she saw her, the lady with broad back. And who was she? She was Mrs. Darling. So her mother was seeing her out, and her mother introduced the narrator to the lady, and she signaled to her, and the woman responded with a nod. She started nodding when she had a look to on the narrator, and she picked the suitcase under the coat rack. She was wearing a brown coat and a shapeless hat, and the narrator asked her mother if she lived far away. So the mother told her that address, that is Marconi Street, number 46. And she had also asked the narrator to remember the address. As she said here, remember that. So when the time will come back to normalcy after the war, the narrator would go back to Mrs. Darling to claim all the things that she is taking away. So that is why she had said particularly that remember this address, number 46, Marconi Street, number 46. This was a complete address of Mrs. Darling. So the narrator's mother had asked the narrator to remember this address. Now she further says, I had remembered it, but I had waited a long time to go there. Initially, after the liberation, I was absolutely not interested in all that stored stuff. Naturally, I was also rather afraid of it. Afraid of being confronted with things that had belonged to a connection that no longer existed. No longer existed means her mother. So she is telling us that she remembered the address, but she took long time to visit the place. And after the freedom, as she is writing there, that after the liberation means liberty or freeing. So after the freedom, she was on one hand not interested, and on the other hand was afraid. And what was she afraid of? She was afraid of getting confronted with the past memories and connections that no longer existed. Okay. And what were the connections? Connections were hidden in cupboards and boxes. And somehow you can take the connections related to her mother also. Might be her mother is no more. So those things and those precious articles and antique things belong to her mother. And sometimes when she was recalling all these things, remembering all those things, she used to think that all these things belong to my mother, and what is the use of all these things to me, because my mother is no more. She was taking a good care of all these things, and she was concerned a lot with all these articles. But what would I do with these things? Because my mother, the connection that she had with all these things, and she is no more. So the things are useless to her. So thinking all these things took a lot of time, and this is what she is regretting now. She is feeling sorry that I took too long time to come back to this address to claim for the things. And it seemed that those memories were waiting in vain to put them back to their places, as they had suffered all these years because they were only things now. But gradually everything became more normal again. bread was getting to be a lighter color. There was a bed you could sleep in unthreatened, a room with a view you were more used to glancing at each day. And one day I noticed I was curious about all the possessions that must still be at that address. I wanted to see them, touch, remember. After my first visit in vain to Mrs. Dolling's house, I decided to try a second time. Now, a girl of about 15 opened the door to me. I asked her if her mother was at home. No, she said, my mother's doing an errand. No matter, I said, I'll wait for her. So she's telling you here that the things were getting normal in the narrator's life, and one day she got curious about all the things that were still at that address, and she wanted to see them and touch them. And after the first hopeless visit, she decided to try one more time. And when she reached Mrs. Dolling's home, second time, a girl of 15 years opened the door. And the narrator asked her about her mother. She told her that she was outside doing some errands. Okay, errands means a short journey. So her mother, Mrs. Dolling, was on a short journey, and to which the narrator decided that she would wait for her. Now, next paragraph says, I followed the girl along the passage. An old-fashioned iron Hanukkah candle holder hung next to a mirror. We never used it because it was much more cumbersome than a single candlestick. Now, Hanukkah means it is the feast of lights and a Hebrew festival in the December month. That is termed as Hanukkah. And as she was crossing by the passage, she had a look on this Hanukkah. It was kept there, and quickly she had gone back into the past time when they were not using it, though it was lying at their home during the war. And she found it kept in Mrs. Dolling's house, and she recalled that though they were having this, but they did not use it at all because it was very cumbersome. Cumbersome means unmanageable or heavy, you may say. So it was very heavy, and that is why her mother was not using it, but it was kept safely at their home. But now it is lying at Mrs. Dolling's home. Won't you sit down? Asked the girl. She held open the door of the living room, and I went inside past her. I stopped, horrified. I was in a room I knew and did not know. I found myself in the midst of things I did want to see again, but which oppressed me in the strange atmosphere, or because of the tasteless way of everything was arranged, because of the ugly furniture or the muggy smell that hung there. I don't know, but I scarcely dared to look around me. The girl moved a chair. I sat down and stared at the wooden tablecloth. I rubbed it. My fingers grew warm from rubbing. I followed the lines of the pattern. Somewhere on the edge there should be a burn mark that had never been repaired. My mother will be back soon, said the girl. I have already made tea for her. Will you have a cup? Thank you. So the narrator followed the girl along the passage, and there was a Hanukkah candle holder hung next to a mirror. She remembered that she never used it as it was unmanageable. The girl asked her to sit down as she opened the door for the living room, and she stopped, and she was disturbed. She was standing in a room which she knew and she didn't. Okay, and the narrator was standing in the middle of things which she didn't want to see, and they burdened her. Maybe because of the way things were arranged, or things were arranged, as she is writing here, in the muggy smell. Muggy means very humid. Okay, so she was standing. She was burdened with the thoughts that how in a tasteless manner the things were arranged, and a humid smell in the room, or the ugly furniture she was down on the chair which the girl pulled out for her, and she looked at the woolen tablecloth. Then she rubbed it, and her fingers felt warm. As she followed the lines of the pattern, she remembered a burn mark that was never repaired. And in the meanwhile, when she was going through all these thoughts, the girl told her that her mother would be back soon and asked if she would like to have a cup of tea. And the narrator answered her in thank you. Then she raised. I looked up. The girl put cups ready on the tea table. She had a broad back, just like her mother. She poured tea from a white pot. All it had was a gold border on the lid. I remembered. She opened a box and took some spoons out. That's a nice box. I heard my own voice. It was a strange voice, as though each sound was different in this room. Oh, you know about them. She had turned round and brought me my tea. She laughed. My mother says it is antique. We have got lots more. She pointed round the room. See for yourself. I had no need to follow her hand. I knew which things she meant. I just looked at the still life over the tea table. As a child, I had always fancied the apple on the pewter plate. Now, the pewter plate is a plate made of grey alloy of tin or zinc, also, you may say. So the narrator looked up. She saw the girl put 2 cups of tea in front of her, and she had a broad back just like her mother. She poured tea from the teapot, and it had a gold border on the lid. And she opened a box and took some spoons out of it. And the narrator complimented the girl about the box. She felt weird hearing her own voice, and it was sounding different to her. As the girl turned to give her a cup, she asked if she knew about the box. Then she added that it is antique according to her mother, and she pointed around the room and said that there are many more. And she told her to see. Although the narrator didn't need to follow her direction, she knew what she was talking about. And she glanced over the tea table. She remembered how she used to fancy the apple on the pewter plate. Then she says, we use it for everything, she said. Once we even ate off the plates hanging there on the wall. I wanted to so much, but it wasn't anything special. I had found the burn mark on the tablecloth. The girl looked questioningly at me. So as the narrator remembered that as a child she had always liked the apple on the pewter plate, the young girl, the daughter of Mrs. Darling, told the narrator that at one time they even ate in the plates hanging on the wall. And the narrator by then had found the burn mark on the tablecloth. And the girl looked curiously at the narrator. Why she started looking curiously, as it is written here, questioningly and curiously at the narrator, because wondering that how this lady knows a lot about all these things, because she was the daughter of Mrs. Darling, and might be she was not aware of the fact that all these things, all these articles that they have been using from the last many years belong to this lady who is sitting in front of her. So that is why she was curious to know that, and wondering that how this lady knows these articles. So children, we are leaving our discussion here. We shall continue the chapter in the next video. Thank you.